Yes. Wendy, can you hear me? Mic test.
Hello.
Wendy, can you hear me?
Yes. Yes.
Mic test 1, 2, 3. Mic. Okay.
Afternoon. I think we can start now. Welcome, everyone. I'm Shweta Saxena. I'm the Chief of Staff at UNECA, and I also wear another hat as the Acting Director for Gender, Poverty, and Social Policy Division. An economist by profession, but have a lot of interest in non-economic stuff, which is actually more political economy or sustainable development. So I'm pleased to actually moderate the session today, which is really on a topic that's very dear to me. Before I go ahead, let me introduce our esteemed panel. So on my right is Professor Kunal Sen. He has over 3 decades of experience in academia and applied development economics research. He's the author of 8 books and the editor of 5 volumes on the economics and political economy of development. Since 2019, he has served as director of UNU Wider while on leave from the Global Development Institute, University of Manchester, where he's a professor of development economics. So welcome, Kunal. Next, on my left is Abebe Shimelis. He's currently the honorary professor at University of Cape Town, Department of Economics. Previously, he worked for the African Economic Research Consortium, the African Development Bank, the World Bank, UNECA, Action AID, Addis Ababa University, and Institute for the Study of Ethiopian Nationalities in different capacities. His research interest lies in broad area of development economics with a focus on Africa. Welcome, Abebe. Then we have Professor Mohammed Saleh. He's on the right to Kunal. He's Emeritus Professor of Politics of Development at the International Institute of Social Studies, Erasmus University, Rotterdam, in the Netherlands. He's co-laureate Nobel Peace Prize for contributing to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC 2007, and awarded an honorary doctorate 2007 in African Studies, University of Copenhagen, Denmark. And I'm not going to list the number of books he's written because I think that will exhaust all the time we have. So welcome, Professor Snellier. And last but not the least, we have Saurabh Sinha here. He has a PhD from IETS Sussex and more than 25 years of economic research and policy advisory experience. As the Chief of Social Policy at the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa since 2016, Saurabh leads the Commission's work on poverty and inequality reduction, employment, social protection, demography, migration, health, education, and skills and youth in Africa. You name it, and he wears a lot of hats here. So welcome, Saurabh. So what I'll do, I think I'll just give you an overview of how the seminar would run. I'll just introduce the topic a little bit, my own take on it, and then I'll hand over to Kunal, who's going to present the report that is a synthesis of a lot of years of research actually from UNU Wider. And then I'll open the floor for questions to the panelists initially. They get 3 minutes to react to questions. They'll get a minute later on to react to each other, and then we'll open the floor to everybody else. Okay. So a few words on the topic. Well, this topic of peace and job couldn't be timelier. The continent is going through a renewed bout of coups and conflicts, which threaten not only the economic stability, but also the social fabric in these countries. We are all very well aware of the cost of conflicts. My own research has shown that in Africa, civil wars on average lead to a permanent loss in output of about 3% in the long run, while changes in governments to more dictatorial regimes lead to a loss of output of about 5%. With such big economic losses, so how do we expect this region to recover and fight the 4 mega trends that are the defining features of our times? So one of the big mega trends is the demographic transition. While the world is aging, Africa is young. Given its very high fertility rates, Africa will provide more than half of the world's population growth between 2022 and 2050. By 2050, more than half of the population of Africa will be below the age of 25. Of course, these young people will need jobs. Second trend that we see around the world is of urbanization. By 2050, the global population is projected to increase to about 9.8 billion, with more than twice as many people living in urban areas as in rural areas. In Africa, 6 in 10 people will be living in urban areas by 2050. In 50 years' time, the number of African cities with a population of at least 1 million will have more than doubled from 60 to 134, and with a population of more than at least 5 million, will have more than quadrupled from 6 to 28. This means, again, we need enough decent jobs to ensure that urban centers do not become slums again. Next is a digitalization. while the pandemic has highlighted the inevitability of digitalization to live our lives, it also highlighted the large digital divides that we see. In 2021, 2.9 billion people in the world were still offline. That's about 37% of the world's population. In Africa alone, only 33% of the population were internet users in 2021, leaving 871 million people who were not realizing any of these digital dividends. We need an Africa that needs to be more inclusive. Lastly, climate change, a phenomenon to which Africa has contributed zilch, but it's the biggest victim of climate change. According to the International Rescue Committee, 7 out of the 10 most vulnerable countries to climate change are in Africa. In the past 50 years, drought related hazards in Africa have claimed the lives of over 500,000 people and led to economic losses of more than 70 billion. Up to 118 million extremely poor Africans could be exposed to droughts, floods, and extreme heat by 2030. The climate migration can be a thorny issue affecting peace and security as well. So we need to actually think about that. Having said that, so these are very interesting times we are living in, very interesting issues, and there is so much to learn from today's panel, very highly esteemed panel that we have, on how Africa can move towards peace and have abundance of jobs that can lead to prosperity of the Africans. So I'll hand over the floor to Kunal to present his research on this topic of peace, decent work, and greater equality. Over to you, Kunal.
Thanks, sir. So I'd like to welcome all of you to this event. I know that today is a national day and must have been quite, wasn't so easy to come to Eneka, but so good to see so many of you here, actually. So fantastic about that. So I want to say that, before I start talking about the report itself, that in 2019, when we started this work program that we are going to talk about today, I'll present the synthesis of that work we did the last 5 years. 2019, the world was a very different place. So we just about started the Agenda 2030, 4 years into the Agenda 2030. Even then, things were looking not so good actually in many of the SDGs in terms of metrics. But certainly, when nobody expected what will happen in 2020 with the pandemic, and then, of course, more recently, the Ukraine crisis and many other conflicts that are going around the world. So the world is in a very different place at this point. Clearly, as we are now closer to the 2030 deadline of the SDGs, we are quite far away from where we should be. There's no doubt about that, and there are obvious reasons why that's the case. But at the same time, and this is something we want to highlight in this report, there are options the policymakers can take to try and push the 2030 agenda in the remaining 7 years or so that we have. There are options that are there, practical, feasible options. And what we're going to try and do is talk a little bit about the options that we have in front of us. And we're going to focus in this particular event on peace building, which is obviously very relevant at this point, and also on decent work. In part, we feel that these two thematic priorities that we talk about in our report are very important in the African context. There is also a lot of discussion in our report on inequality or great equality. So that's not that we do not think that's not important in this continent, but just because of want of time, we're focusing on peace and on decent work. I want to say a few words about UNE wider. I mean, perhaps most of you might have heard about us. We are based in Helsinki. We are part of the United Nations University, which is the research arm of the United Nations. And we are a UN agency, a research unit, and also a think tank all rolled into one. And we try, and our primary focus is, of course, development economics. It's the United Nations University World Institute for Development Economics Research. So that's right in our name. So a lot of work is on economic development, but that's not the only thing we do. And as you will see in this report, we also talk a lot about, we also work on governance and also around political issues too. So that's what we are. And I'm so pleased that we're doing this joint event with UNECA because much of our work in the last 5 years has been on Africa. And in 4 important ways, and I want to just mention that. First, research. And many of the papers that we've done, the working papers, there are about 700 working papers that feed into this particular report. A lot of them are on Africa, across the continent, Francophone Africa, and also Anglophone Africa, and also Portuguese-speaking Africa. So we have a lot of work on Africa, research. So that's very important. And we have lots of scholars from African countries working with us on different projects. If you look at our working paper series, you'll see how many early career scholars in particular and female scholars are involved with us in the research, number one. Number two, capacity building. We take capacity building very seriously. Let me give you a couple of examples. One is that we're working with revenue authorities in Africa to try to make the tax data, the administrative tax data, available for research. So we have now a data lab, secure data lab in Uganda. We had one in South Africa earlier. We're looking at possibilities in Zambia and elsewhere. So we're working with revenue authorities to first co-produce also research from this data sets and that we have, but also to help them to make the data sets available for researchers and policymakers. So that's important. Along with that, another area of capacity building is we work with policymakers here and do training on microsimulation models that we have that looks at if you change taxes, if you increase VAT, what happens to poverty, inequality, and then if you increase the VAT revenues, can you use it for cash transfers, and what would that mean? So these microsimulation models are very important for policymakers. We notice, so we're working with ministries of finance and others on this microsimulation models and holding training programs, training for them in person most of the time, all around the year. So that's another example of capacity building. Thirdly, we have our two most important country programs are in Africa. One is in Mozambique, the other is in South Africa. And we're also exploring, of course, looking at other possibilities in the continent. So in this country programs, we work with the Ministry of Economics and Finance in Mozambique, with the National Treasury in South Africa, and we co-produce research on policy relevant issues that they are obviously they have to address in their own context. And so we have our own colleagues based in these two countries, working with colleagues from the National Treasury in South Africa, the Ministry of Economics and Finance in Mozambique, and that's a really great example of how the UNE wider, and actually I would say the UNU itself as a thought leader for the UN works in partnership with member countries in the continent. And finally, of course, we do a lot of policy debates, policy influencing. This is an example of that. And I think we take that seriously because research has to be leading to some policy change. There's no point doing blue skies research. That's not what we do in UniWider. So a lot of what we try and do is try to change policies. And we do it not only through, obviously publications, but blogs and communications. Our website is very important as a resource for policymakers. So many ways, we may do it in many ways. And that's also very important for us. And a lot of that is focused on Africa. So therefore, in that sense, it's great to be here in UNECA and in partnership with UNECA and doing this event because of the importance that Africa has in the UNE Wider's work. And that's something that I think we take very seriously. And I want to just sort of go on to the report itself. And I just want to say that this report summarizes and synthesizes our work for the last 5 years. And of course, that means that we had to really take difficult decisions of what to bring in, what to take out, and really focus on the key messages that are coming out from the 700 papers that we did in the last 5 years, working papers, and try to synthesize the real findings. And then what are the policy options that we think are really relevant going forward? So I'm going to present the report. I just want to say that though my name is there on the slide, this is a collective report written by all our colleagues in wider, but also all the researchers we're working with in Africa, Asia, Latin America. So that's just important to keep in mind. I'm just really here to present a collective effort here. So let me see if this moves. Yes, there we are. So basically, I don't want to go through the slides. Very clear. This is going through a 5-year research work program, and the work program is focusing on transforming economies, states, and societies, which pretty much covers quite a bit of the 2030 agenda. We focus in particular on 5 SDGs. We focused on SDG 5, which is gender equality. We focus on SDG 8, this is decent work. We focus on this SDG 10, which is on inequality, 16, which is on peace and just institutions, and 17 on partnerships. So 5 SDGs, we knew that we are a relatively small institution, and so we could not work on all 17 SDGs, but we focus on the 5 that we thought we could add value to. So just as this is something that is perhaps very well understood, especially in the context of where we are today, actually. We are in a situation where there's been this, societies are being transformed in a forge of heightened concern around a critical threat, whether it's a global pandemic, which happened a couple of years back, financial crisis, which happened earlier in the mid 2000s, or as we are in the situation now, wars and violent conflict. And of course, this kind of crisis, whether it's economic crisis, whether it's a political crisis, whether it's a health crisis, they have implications for the long term. They lead to stagnant growth for prolonged periods and increased household vulnerability. That's very obvious right now with the Ukraine crisis, with food prices really increasing dramatically. Many African countries are food importers. So that's a very obvious example of how the one crisis in one part of the world is having effects on the rest of the world itself, especially in the global south. And of course, the problem is with the crisis, and this is particularly clear with the 2008 financial crisis, the 2008 financial crisis has had a long-term negative effect on well-being of, and not only in the developing countries but also in developed countries. So that 2008 financial crisis had a very long-term effect that is still we haven't yet able to reverse. And so currently, of course, we are in the situation that happened, then the pandemic happened, then the Ukraine crisis happened, and then more recently developments happening in the Middle East. So we are in a situation where we are where there are these shocks happening which are having long-term effects. But at the same time, we think from this legacies of crisis, we can still see opportunities for action, and which we will discuss. So the report itself, and the report, there's several copies outside. And this is what it is. It's on our website also, so you don't need to necessarily carry it if you don't want to, a physical copy. But so it's not very heavy, But it's a three parts: the aspiration for peace, which is we'll focus on that in the presentation; aspiration of decent work, which we'll also focus on; and the aspiration of fairer society on inequality, which we'll have less to say. But happy to come back to it in the Q&A discussion if that's of interest also. So aspiration of peace. Now, it's quite clear. I mean, it's very obvious that we are in a situation where we have seen increase in conflict in many parts of the world. And there was that's one thing that one often forgets, that the gap between peaceful and conflict-free societies, one outcome of this, that we see big difference in poverty reduction. So if you look at what's happening in poverty reduction, poverty has been falling. Global poverty has been falling. But now what's happening is much of the global poor are being concentrated mostly in the fragile and conflict-affected states. And that's very worrying, because it's becoming more a fragility problem than what used to be more a development problem. And wars and violent conflict shape the state building and economic development processes far into the future and require ongoing response. It's not what happens in the next couple of years. It's a long-term sad process. So the first piece. So basically, what we did in this part of the report is to look at three critical elements of peace. That was in rebuilding the state, building the social contract, encouraging non-violent political participation. And I think so. Our work really is about the legacies of violent conflict. We're talking about conflict where the violence is a feature, and endemic violence is a feature, and we're trying to understand what does that means for the future of these countries where we do see violent conflict. And I think one point that we're going to make again and again is that we need to strengthen the social contract between states and citizens and improve livelihoods between social groups, which are absolute central parts of development outcomes. So the social contract, and this is something this has been also resonates in the United Nations now in the discussion going on our common agenda, that this is something that we need to think about. How do we rebuild a social contract? Forget about strengthening it, because in many parts of the world, we don't even see a functioning social contract. So on rebuilding the state, first, on this, the main thing here is that we need to think of how we can think about prosperous peace in the local context, local communities, particularly where we have such as a wartime governance maintained by non-state actors. It's a feature of countries which are in the space of having conflict affected, that we see several non-state actors who are very powerful. And it's important to understand that they function very much at the local level. To develop state legitimacy, the governing authority must meet the needs of local communities at the local level. That's really important. And grassroots actors can be critical allies for the state in peace building. And that's often ignored and often forgotten. So a state building framework with a twin objective of sending the state, which has to be the case, in this kind of country, in this sort of context, the state is really important, and we often see very weak state capacity. So we have to strengthen the state. But along with that, we have to also strengthen civil society actors and try to make sure that there is a collaborative relationship between the state and civil society actors, so that we're more likely to achieve positive results, especially at the local level. Going back to the social contract, we also differ a little bit from often what is a commonly held view, that we have to think about this peace building through the state. So a state-centric view. The peace and development are best achieved through a centralized authority that ensures the rule of law. Now, it's understandable why we have this view, because we think, well, how do we stop violence? If you have a strong centralized authority who can exercise their authority in that country, around its territories. So that's quite understandable why there is a view that we need to have a strong centralized authority to maintain the peace, to maintain the rule of law. But what we are arguing in this report is that it is worthwhile to support autonomous institution building efforts at both central and local levels. It's not that we don't think the state is important. It is obviously important, but in fact, we also need to find ways to build autonomous institutions that both at the central level, but also local levels. And by doing so, replace wartime economic structures that are in place, particularly where we have very powerful non-state actors who are also engaged in violent conflict. So the ability to control the territory depends on the state. If the state can legitimize its authority through basic rights and human economic needs. So here is where the social contract is important, because the more the state can deliver education, health, peace, security, and so on, the more legitimate it is, and the more likely the citizens are not going to turn to non-state actors for resolving their own problems, which has happened in many of these countries that are, in particular, in sub-Saharan Africa. So that's very important that we think about this, where we think both the state is important in doing its job, in providing public goods and providing peace and rule of law to its citizens. At the same time, you have to have autonomous institutions that are both at the central and local level. The third point here we want to make in this work on peace building is that encouraging non-violent political participation. So provision of meaningful political representation and support for grassroots democracy can re-establish trust in the state and encourage non-violent redress of grievances. The more likely that grievances are gone through non-violent channels rather than people taking the street on the street and then using violent means to overthrow the state in certain cases, the more likely we'll see true democracy. So often there's been a mistake, perhaps, among the international community to rush to hold elections. Now, that may work in certain contexts, but it may not be the surest way to meet local needs or establish state legitimacy in the near term. So our argument is that while elections are important and they need to be there at some point, it's also important to keep in mind that democracy can also work on a grassroots level by engaging with those those who are at the local level. So that's something we want to say, that perhaps moving away from a more state-centric view and also not looking at elections as a means to mechanism of trying to bring about democracy in the country. It's also important not to overlook the role of violent conflict in strengthening political participation at local levels. And we see that actually, strangely enough, conflict affected communities often have more incentive to engage in politically in a positive way. And that makes sense, because if we think of a conflict affected community, they are reaching out for peace, and for them, engaging politically is very important. And that's why, actually, in those sorts of communities, you're more likely to see efforts to build grassroots democracy. It may seem a contradiction, but that's what we find, and that's something that perhaps is not so surprising. And that's something we find in our work. Now I want to move on to the next bit of our work. The second thematic priority is on decent work, SDG 8 and SDG 5. SDG 5 being gender equality and SDG 8 being on decent work. And what we see, and this is particularly true in Sub-Saharan Africa more than perhaps any other region, the other comparable region here is South Asia. We see that most workers in Sub-Saharan Africa are informal workers. In other words, they don't have labor rights, they don't have social protection, they don't have any other mechanism to represent themselves among trade unions and so on. So the numbers vary, but you're looking at around 80 to 90% of total workers, the total workforce, are informal workers. There are a few countries which are not in this category. In Sub-Saharan Africa, obvious outlier is South Africa. South Africa is not in this space. South Africa, majority of workers are in the formal sector, but South Africa is an outlier. Other than South Africa, most countries in Sub-Saharan Africa, number of workers in the informal sector, informal workers, are significantly proportional to total workforce. And so we have a situation where 2/3 of jobs are in the informal sector. And of course, it's obvious that if you're informally employed, you earn less, you lack the same protection as formal sector workers. That's very obvious. That's very nature of informality, actually. And they're more vulnerable to economic shocks. This was very clear in the pandemic. If you look at the pandemic's effects, across the world, it had differential effects in different parts of the world. Some regions were more badly affected by the pandemic, others less. But one thing that stands out in the developing world is that in each country where the workers were badly hit, it were the informal workers. And actually, most of them, in many cases, women informal, because in Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, majority of workers who are informally employed, especially in the lowest kind of low jobs, are women, self-employed. So self-employment is a big category in sub-Saharan Africa, and informal self-employment, and a lot of those who are in that kind of work are women, so who own their own enterprises. So this shock that happened with the pandemic was very differentially felt, not only across the world but also within countries, and that's something we forget. That there was a very major effect on informal workers, and it's very obvious because once there were lockdowns, informal workers need to go and work. There was no way they could go out and work. And lockdowns happened for a long time. And even when lockdowns lifted, things didn't come back to the normal situation pre-pandemic. So that was something we find. And in fact, one very interesting example of that is the work we did in Ghana. The work we did in Ghana allowed us to do something which is not possible in many other countries, because in Ghana, they implemented the COVID-19 lockdown policy differentially across the country. So there were particular kind of regions like Greater Accra and Greater Kumasi, where there was complete lockdown for 3 weeks. And there are other regions where more or less things were okay. I mean, people could go out and work. So that was useful for us because then you could see what happened in these two regions in Ghana and compare that to where other regions were not affected by lockdown. And that allows us to, basically we are doing like for like comparison, because if you're comparing countries, it's very difficult to know what's really happening. So here we were pretty clear that this is what we're capturing, the lockdowns effect on informal workers. And what we find that it, as I was saying, the most pronounced effects were workers in informal self-employment, and in that category, mostly women. And what was interesting is even after lockdowns lifted, after this 3 weeks period that we had in between March and April, things didn't come back to normal. Employment was still below pre-pandemic levels. Earnings were still below pre-pandemic levels. Of course, they recovered. But not back to where they were before. And that tells you that the pandemic has had, even one could even say, medium term, long term maybe a bit too, may not be the right way to think about it, but certainly medium term effects. In other words, when the pandemic lockdown stopped, things were not back to normal. And that's something we see particularly among informal workers. So moving on, so what we also try to do is we try to look at, the question is that, okay, I'm an informal worker, particularly I'm at a very lower level of informal work, like I'm a street vendor, let's say. What's the likelihood that I'm able to do something better in my life, right? Maybe I can become a mechanic, or I can be somewhere working in the informal sector, but a better kind of job. And maybe I could even get a job in a factory as a formal worker. All right. And what we did, we compared, we looked at these jobs that workers were doing and followed them over time. So basically using panel data. And what we find is that those are the lower tier, the lowest level of informal work, hardly move from where they were. So you're a street vendor, more likely your child will also be a street vendor. So the lack of this mobility at the lowest level was quite striking, while there was much more mobility at the upper level. So if you have a upper tier, like I said, a mechanic can, for example, work in a factory at some point. So those are upper tier jobs. They are still informal because you don't have a formal written contract for mechanics sometimes. And so in those kind of situations, we see mobility, but not in the lowest level. And in sub-Saharan Africa, the biggest problem is on self-employment, informal self-employment. So micro enterprises, which basically are household enterprises. That's where most of the workers are. And that's why we see very little mobility. And that's something we need to think about for the future. So on gender, we did a lot of work, because in gender, there are two things that are particularly very important. One is what we can call the quantity of work. So are women in the labor force or not? And there again, we see big differences across the global south. So Middle East and North Africa, the female labor force participation rate is shockingly low at around 20%. Southeast is 24%. Sub-Saharan Africa is actually higher. But that's one metric, quantity of women's employment. But the other metric, which people often do not highlight, is the quality of employment. What kind of work are women doing? And we find that most of the time they're doing, even when they're working, they're in vulnerable employment. So exactly, self-employment is a very good example, own account enterprises. So we find that when we control for everything else, and individual household characteristics, women are 7% percentage point more likely to be in vulnerable employment than men. So there's a quantity problem in case of the gender gap. There's also a quality problem. And I think we need to keep in mind that the quality problem can be as important as the quantity problem, right? The other thing we find, as in these papers we did in this area, we find that marriage and parenthood are important drivers of gender gaps in pay and quantity and quality of employment. And this is experienced differentially by women than by men. So the route to social and economic empowerment for women concerns society's ability to enable women to navigate this life transition between school, work, marriage, parenthood without equal sacrifice. Because when these transitions happen, women are definitely much more affected than men. And again, there's some positive news. In other words, countries which have less conservative gender norms, more generous family policies, so you have a longer maternity leave policies, or easier way to get back to work once you take a break from work. All those things can actually help women in getting back to productive work. And even when they come back to work, they're not working in the kind of the bad jobs, if you wish. Sometimes they come back to better jobs. So this thing of how countries handle this issue by providing more gender equality in laws, and in more greater gender equality in marriage, parenthood, assets, and so on and so forth, but also trying to have more generous family policies is a very important example of what governments can do to make the transitions much more smoother for women compared to men. Okay, so let me very quickly talk about policy options. The first, the slide on policy piece, we already more or less made we made the points earlier that we need to think about wartime governance made by non-state actors and deal with that in a way where perhaps sometimes the view is that, well, we don't want to engage with the non-state actors because, of course, they are engaged often in violent conflict, but we need to find a way to engage with them because they're so important in building societies afterwards. State building framework that is about strengthening state capacity and civil society actors in tandem is very important, more likely to achieve results. And of course, communication and coordination between community institutions and the state can really support the peace process. And that's something that often doesn't really happen in this kind of context. And just one big point here that perhaps moving away from a state-centric view, that everything happens through the centralized authority that ensures the rule of law, and also understanding that autonomous institution building is also important is something we need to think about. That the state itself is not the only way we can think about peace building. So I'll just move on now to the next final slide, well, the second last slide. So I think that one of the things that we also discuss in our work, and there's a book coming out from Oxford University Press, that one lesson we learned from the pandemic, which we cannot have the same again the next time something that kind happens, that the way we treat informal workers cannot happen again. And we have to have a new social contract for informal workers where they're protected for the next time there's a big global shock, right? We need to find ways that we reach out to them, because many times in many governments, what they did was mostly target formal sector workers in protection, cash transfers or micro enterprise support and so on. The informal workers were kind of left out. We cannot have that. And we need to make sure there's a new social contract that does not ignore them in the contract we have with the state and the capital. Because if we don't learn that lesson from this pandemic, it would be terrible. And of course, we have to think about active labor market policies, especially target this lower tier, this ones who are, as I said, street vendors and web speakers and so on, and find ways to help them because they are the ones who are least likely to move out and the ones who are the lowest paid. So how do we do that? And we do argue that we need to think about how we can increase the livelihoods of these workers, think about ways to make urban planning processes inclusive of these workers. So rather than chase these web speakers out of the city, find ways to bring them in, not tax informal enterprises, find ways to bring them in, again, not necessarily through taxation, but other ways into planning processes. So there are many things one can do. And it's not really happening at the moment. Gender equality, we talked about transitions and life transitions, and of course, so I will not repeat that. I just want to end by saying that that really the key central message from the findings of our 5-year work program is there are opportunities for action. Even in this rather bleak situation we are in right now, there are things that actions are possible, which are both feasible and perhaps doesn't need a lot of funding. It's not that, even though we are in a situation where states are fiscally constrained right now, a lot of countries are in debt distress, even with those constraints, there's still things one can do, right? Around reforming laws and so on and so forth, and things like that. So we can try and do a lot more there. And we need to find ways to meet the legitimate demands of citizens. whether it's on peace building issues, whether it's on decent work issues. We need to find ways to meet the legitimate demands of citizens, because if we don't, then of course we're going to see recurrence of violence and violent conflict and so on. And so the need of the hour is to reestablish a workable social contract. The words social contracts often get banded around. So we're talking about a functioning social contract, the one that makes sense in a country context, and that can differ across countries. It cannot be the same. And we need to find that between citizens and governments, society and the state, both for current and of course for future generations. Let me stop here. Thanks.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much. This was wonderful. I really enjoyed it. Yeah. Thanks, Konal, actually. So what I heard, I don't know if some of my colleagues actually from GPSPD also heard, was that we need a new social contract, and where the ones that we have are not working. And I'm pleased to hear that message coming from you, because next week we are holding our 5th committee on social policy, poverty and gender. And the theme is building new social contracts in Africa. I mean, yeah, so how to fulfill the aspirations of the Africans. Anyway, so thank you for saying that. And actually, one thing I really appreciated, that at the end you were making a point about people say that we don't have the money, so we can't actually achieve anything. But there are lots of things we can do without money as well. And I remember my very first report that I wrote at SCAP was about estimating investment needs to achieve the SDGs. And some of the goals we didn't measure, basically because it would have been double counting. How do you achieve gender equality when you already have universal education, universal healthcare? Gender equality is inbuilt there. But for gender equality, you really don't need money. I mean, there are laws that you can change, with the stroke of a pen. You don't need money for that. To change institutions, you really don't need money for that. I mean, so a lot of stuff actually can be done without money as well. So sometimes when countries are sitting around and saying that we don't have the money to do anything, I mean, I think that's a very lame excuse. So I'm glad that actually you brought that up. And thank you for bringing the one on gender about, how the life cycle in women's lives actually can be affecting a lot of the gender inequality. And just to mention that this year's Nobel in economics went to Claudia Golden, and I really love her work. Actually, I'm very fond of her work, and she kind of makes a similar point. I mean, she doesn't say that there is a gender pay gap actually when people start their careers, but over time it does. And partly also coming from the fact that women tend to get, I mean, when they have their families, they take a seat back, they actually sit at home and not actually. So again, having, right, I mean, and that's where having family policies, family friendly policies might actually close the gender gap a lot more. So I love her work actually a lot on this one. Now, given I'm the I'm the moderator, I have the prerogative to ask the very first question. So let me just start off with you, Konal. The delivery of aid is often affected by conflict and fragility, and in some cases diverted in ways that can be harmful. And some people use this fact as arguing that aid to fragile countries and conflict afflicted areas should not be given. So what does your research evidence tell us about the effects of aid in fragile and conflict afflicted countries, and how critical is provision of aid in these contexts, and how does the international community provide aid to establish peace? So something to do with, because aid has been a very controversial thing. I mean, and when I myself have worked on it actually, and I've seen different views over time.
That's a very important question, especially now, I would say, actually. And I think the important point here is, that there are two kinds of aid, very broadly speaking. One is humanitarian aid, as we see at the current situation, and other is developmental aid, right? Now, humanitarian aid is absolutely critical. No doubt about that, right? And UN has done a fantastic job, I think, in delivering that across the world. But the point is, developmental aid is important because it builds institutions, builds the state, allows the country to move out of conflict, because that should be the primary focus, right? Yes, there is a humanitarian crisis, but we need to help the citizens of that country. But really, what you want is to see the country move out of that situation, so that we don't need to think about the country being, where it's not perpetually in need of humanitarian aid, right? And what's been happening, if you look at OECD DAC numbers, been crowding out of development aid for fragile countries. So increasing donors are giving money for humanitarian reasons and not for development reasons in the fragile states. Now, of course, there are financial constraints. You can't do everything, but it's a mistake if it goes too far in one direction. So we need to be careful about this. And I do think that the major donor countries have to be worried about this. Why is it that the developmental aid part fragile states are being crowded out? And so I talked about poverty. Ultimately, the best mechanism of poverty, and some people may not agree with me on this, is rapid economic growth, sustained growth. And you cannot have growth if you don't allow for aid to come in to support institutions that can bring about growth. And we know the aid has a positive effect on growth under certain conditions. So aid is critical for these fragile states to get out of a situation where 2/3 of the world's poor are going to be in these countries in about in 7 years' time, right? So that's important. Second is extremism being there and migration out of these countries. So there's a lot of legitimate concern about migration out of these conflicted states. Well, the best way to think about this is to make sure that doesn't happen by providing aid to support these countries and making sure that extremism, violent conflict doesn't spill out and people have to leave in all very dire circumstances, right? So that's why aid in this context is perhaps, if we just want to use an economics term, higher returns than aid in non-fragile states. And even though it's risky and sometimes you do not know what the payoff is and things can go wrong, as we also know, but you got to keep the faith, right? So I think the point here is that actually aid is more effective in fragile states. And actually, it's very important that the international donor community support these countries, especially for developmental aid and not just on humanitarian aid.
No, thanks. Actually, it's a very important point. In fact, I mean, as people who work on this topic must know, views have actually varied from David Laurer saying it doesn't help growth. I mean, it's really bad, and some people coming in and saying no, it's good. And then again, I think it was a paper by Subramaniam and Rajan that came out actually against aid also. But until I think somebody came along from CGD, it was Steve Radlett and co-authors, when they came out saying that they split aid into humanitarian and non-humanitarian, because people just look at aid as aid, but humanitarian aid is not supposed to help in growth and all those kind of things as well. So when the moment they split it and actually showed that non-humanitarian aid actually was helpful in growth and all those kind of things, so things changed a little bit. So I think I totally agree with you that it could be actually more effective and it's more needed in conflict states then. Okay, so let's actually move on to let's continue the piece a little bit more, and we have an expert on peace, Professor Salai. So let me ask you, Professor Salai, what are some of the common pitfalls, mistakes and pitfalls that peacemakers, and I'm talking about many different ones, local state actors, donor funded organizations, international actors, they fall into? What have you learned? Have you learned any lessons from all the mistakes that they have made so far?
Thank you very much. Let me take just 1 or 2 minutes to say something about the report as a whole. I think I found it a very accomplished piece of work. It is done by people, according to me, they are really at the cutting edge of their profession. It is accessible even to the non-specialist. The illustrations also are very, very good. I really admire that. And the structure of the program, it's very good. And I think that your presentation also highlighted some issues were not that clear in the report. So also I congratulate you for that. But that is very, I really like congratulations, of course, to you and your colleagues for this very good work. I think it will be a reference work for many people who are in our profession, so to speak. Now, I have about only 4 pitfalls that I can talk about. Now, you see that it is a bad word, but from donors and partners, they look at state building programs in a very short term, while the state building, in fact, is a very long process. It starts with processes that have been taking place well before the conflict started. That is the state formation. And I don't know how we came to the idea that we look at the state building as a technical, mechanical issue that has to do with capacity building. That is meaning that state capacity building. You get me? Meaning that once you look at this, what you are going to do is you mute out the political and social structures that have contributed to conflict and the state fragility, and sometimes even the state collapse. And you focus only on the technical issues in terms of, we know them, training, that's capacity building, improvements in capacities in the area of service delivery, and many other aspects. Of course, we all know them. Even just look at UNDP, the three aspects of capacity building that they deal with institutions and so on and so forth. Now, to me, this is a major pitfall. And I think that it is sad that somebody like Fukuyama, who did very good work in the area of capacity state building, he fell into the trap, and his description is also mechanical and technical. I think that's a major pitfall. I think it is state building. I think it is the arena of the confrontation and attestation of the different forces that make history and make the state and build the social contract in terms of the interactions between these. Now, this does not mean that state building as it is now, it is bad, but it misses that dimension. And I think for some reason, I know donors and others, financial institutions and others, come to politics only at the time of peace negotiations and the conferences of peace negotiations. They come to it at a very late time after the damage has been done. Of course, they try to put some sort of pressure and influence. And we know the toolkit. It is very clear that you have to be part of the integrated into the global economy. It is created a market economy in terms of integration. Anyway, you can call it the liberal principles, the three. You come to them a little bit late, not at a much earlier. When in fact we see they are signposts that the conflict might erupt at that time. Looking at this, so I think that is something that probably we have to look much more deeper than the technical. The second one that I have here is that this capacity, you talk about building the capacity of the state, yet the interventions are compartmentalized. You deal with a division within a government department or a department within the government. Of course, it will be unfair on the state and those who try to build the state and help the state, to be able to attend to its functions that we know, which you eloquently expressed in your report. What is important is how to be able to create these new dynamics through which this idea of building the state takes new meaning. I know, for instance, in your report, you say that, well, the dominant institutions during the conflict can be, you did not say rely on, but it might give a better dispensation for reaching some sort of stability or a functioning institutions. I think you are right. But the problem is that we have noticed that all these different liberation movements and groups that are involved in the war, they give democracy lip service. And they always find it very difficult to be democratic after they have obtained power from the state. The danger with their institutions is that the institutions were built during times of war and they are not democratic. The movements themselves are extra-constitutional. And the organizations that they create are also extra constitutions. And they remain with their names, with symbols, their ideological orientations, everything. To twist them or to tweak them from being working with dictates, because the war does not probably allow the space for so much democratic discussion about shall we go or shall we go? What do you think? Commanders give you the go and you go. And some, of course, some of these values and behaviors that acquired during the war, they continue with them. So I have a little bit of doubt about whether these institutions that they have created, take the country where we are now and also Eritrea. They have two systems of, we call it military civilian system during the first war, not this one, which ended in 1991. You have the TPLF, they have a system cascaded from the village neighborhood, from the Tabia and this up to the Baito and up to the big structure to the Warada. It has an internal democratic structure that's going with it. One would think that after they have they were able to become victorious and control the state and the resources of the state and all of that, this system will be much more democratic in its orientation than what happened in Tigray, for instance. It is a very highly centralized in Tigray, in Eritrea, not in Tigray, highly centralized. But once the rebel forces took government, in fact, they became much more authoritarian. So the little democracies that they used to have during the war, allowing the social and grassroots organizations operate. You find, if you are in that area during the war, you find women with their mules taking supplies to the fighters in different places, independent of anybody. They know what days they go there and what day, and the whole structure. But it's highly centralized. You see, highly decentralized. Both of them failed. Why? Because it's the original attitude and behavior of liberation movements and the difficulty of democratizing them. Very few of them became and continue their democratic. And even those who continue, who started to become democratic and want to continue democratic, you have state capture in South Africa. You have a dominance of particular groups also in Namibia. You have a lot of difficulties in Sierra Leone today. The same thing, Liberia probably will give a very bad example because the only ones who have the resources to integrate the Liberian economy into the global economy were the warlords, because they are dealing with diamonds and steel and timber and everything. They took the government hostage and became the ministers and everything. They have difficulties today as I am speaking. So I think these are some of the challenges. Maybe I can say one more, and that is maybe I can, that is this. You mentioned something that I appreciate very much, that informal institutions or institutions that are not part of the state can also be a force for peace and state building. I agree with you on that. My only trouble is with civil society. Civil society is a pleasure group capable of deconstructing, but not constructing. By its nature, civil society is not to contest elections in order to be able to control the state and the resources of the state and the power and everything. They are disruptors, so to speak. And these disruptors, even in peace negotiations, the fighting groups do not listen to them. Of course, they go and do their thing. I know we all love civil society. I don't know who doesn't love civil society in this room. But this is one. But you can. The problem is that they shy away from the informal institutions, particularly the not local government, even chieftains, some very influential local leaders, so and so. In Darfur in Sudan, what happened is that UNDP started a fantastic program. Their idea is straightforward. You see, we who have this modern education in political science and public administration, economics, and all of that, we think that these rural communities and indigenous population, or tribals or whatever ethnic groups, when they have fights and they have war or conflicts, these conflicts go endlessly. We assume that probably they do not have mechanisms and norms for conflict management and conflict resolution. They do have. In fact, close to 80% of their conflicts are resolved outside the state domain and state institutions. And they had a meeting in Doha, in Qatar, and they came with a big resolution. We empower the local institutions, not civil society, the local institutions, we empower them. The first one to resist that, the Sudan government and the rebel forces. Both of them, can you imagine? So to agree on that. These guys should not be part of it. Why? Because they feel that the moment the local community and population are interested in the peace processes, that they are dislocated from being the interlocutors with the international partners and the international peace negotiations and the international money and the international. There will be a resource shift for peace building and peacemaking from the state center to the local communities. You see, so for me, I like your when you were say that that these policy frameworks, they have also to support autonomous institution building, and both at the central and the local levels. I agree with you, and I think that is something that I would really like to work with myself, because I don't know. I examined more than 6 PhDs about local conflict management, a whole PhD, and different conflicts and how they are resolved by the local thing. So I want to see how that. My last one is you did not. Shall I stop?
Just quickly.
Okay, very quickly. I like your new program. 2024-28, and in which you retain 2 of the old ones and have the climate change as a main, and I think I love that. But for me, just to be consistent for the sake of my own writings and my views, epistemological, simply that, please, in climate change, the global is local. Global climate change is the aggregate of local processes of production, consumption that are framed by policies, politics, and economic structures. That is all. You see it in the transport systems. You see it in the garbage collection. You see it in emission control from cars and industries. You see it in the urban mood, the building construction, and all of that. Like you in economics, you say how economics is household. You talk about the household economics, that is the aggregate of the national economy. These local processes that take place in every town, every village, everywhere. That is where climate change. Now we see that climate change processes, negotiations, and policies are taken away from the cosmopolitan towns, taken away from the towns, from local governments, from all of that. They are centered. If you find a way to decenter it, because, and I like the way your emphasis always on democracy, and that democracy helps, decentering climate change policies and cascading them from the local and building them up to become global. Because in the democratic principle, it is very simple. Every major issue that affects citizens should have a say in it. So I beg you do something on local climate change. Not because I have a book on that. I know this is a very bad comment, but please don't. Climate finance, trade permits of pollution, God knows what. All of that people have been doing it. But it will not go down to benefit. I know I have it. Of course, I did a lot of things on my own house in the Netherlands because I want to get the subsidy from the government. But who will give the, the subsidy to the farmers and to this and to that? Whether this climate, whether this a climate change finance will find your way also to trickle down to the people who are going to affect by it more probably than the affluent, because it has this differential impact. Yeah. Sorry, it took me quite some time. Thank you.
So let's actually quickly move, and I'll come back to you later on with another question I have for you.
Yeah, okay.
Let's move on to from peace a little bit towards from conflict towards peace. So peace requires macroeconomic stability. Sorry. So let me ask Abebe, given that the current reality, and I think Konal was mentioning in his thing too, reality for many countries, one is of debt distress. So how should policymakers think about prioritizing provision of decent work, first of all? And also, if you wanted to tackle along with this, also the fact that, a lot of workers, as Konal was also mentioning, are in the informal sector. So how to bring actually, decent work to those ones?
Thanks a lot. Let me also acknowledge the host ECA and UN Wider for inviting me to participate in this wonderful panel. I joined Professor Saleh in saying that I really enjoyed the report. This is not just to say to be nice to you, Kunal. And honestly, I found it a very creative way of channeling research findings to the general public, policymakers, practitioners, because they can learn a lot, and researchers also can use, the guiding posts there and go into the papers to learn more. So it's a wonderful way of sharing a huge amount of research in this area. So, Sweta, to your question, let me just start by saying, the moment you begin talking about decent work as a policy maker in Africa, there is nothing else you can think of, and you can talk about it until, as we say, the cows come home. So, at least from the little experience I've had in this area, I would just pick a couple of points. One, with or without debt distress, I think the policymakers, they have to keep the creation of jobs as their permanent policy goal. That's, I think, my personal thinking, especially after pouring through data that we have on Africa's labor market conditions. I don't think any policymaker would have a good night's sleep knowing how many of our youth and our general population suffer just because we are not doing the right things. So that brings me two areas for the decision makers, and I'll come back to the debt distress in a moment. One is the political economy dimension. I think this has been often either taken for granted, usually by researchers. You assume the social contract is in place and there is a social planner that optimizes priorities. But oftentimes, when those do not exist, whatever we say about the best way of creating decent jobs within a reasonable time period and then allocating the resources, sectoral priorities, and macroeconomic framework just come to become void. So basically, the political economy is important. Let me just cite for you one evidence that I have been able to learn from the World Bank's Enterprise Survey across several African countries. And businesses were asked, what is your most important constraint for expanding, creating jobs, etc.? Most of us would think infrastructure, power, skills, finance, etc. But the top 5 listed in Africa were all political economy factors, impediments by the system, law and order, lack of court resolutions, for instance, whenever they encounter issues, bribery, etc. It's like, they are operating in an environment of thugs. So these are, yes. So so the political economy, the whole spectrum has to be, I think, most important for discussion. The other is really reimagining where the jobs can come from. If you use current economic structure, you'll never be able to figure out where to create decent jobs in any African country. So which means, take Ethiopia, for instance, and you look at its economy like a balance sheet or a social accounting metrics, and then you want to run a few creative way of generating where is the best jobs that come from. Essentially, you end up in places where you don't want to. So reimagination is very, very important, which means the decision makers need to anticipate 10 years down the line, where is the most comparative advantage this country has, and then where should we be investing our resources. So to me, the creation of decent work is a lifetime work for policymakers. It's not temporal, it's not we do it this way and then we leave it. It is a very important and complex task. They need to invest on human capital, the supply side. They need to invest on labor market conditions. They need to invest on the demand side. Now, when it comes to where Africa is today, should we really focus on creating jobs under a very difficult macroeconomic environment, and fiscal sustainability is very difficult? My answer is yes. Again, let me give you this should be an opportunity even for African countries to do what they have for a long time have not done so. Let's say market reforms, institutional reforms, etc. All of them tend to support both macroeconomic stability at the same time promote growth and employment. But if you look at today, for instance, the balance sheet, it's not good. Between 2019 and 2021, debt service by African countries increased by $3 billion US. As a share of exports, it's about 26% from about 17% in 2019. And I think my colleague from IMF agrees. If you exceed a share of 15% of exports on your external debts, the solvency, the liquidity issue become very, very tough to sustain debt. So fiscal conditions and even revenue has declined in Africa, and headline inflation has been more than double digits, the median since the COVID and to this day. I mean, the ripple effects of the war in Ukraine. However, in my view, I think this is even a time for the governments in Africa to look into several market reforms, because if you look at many countries where how the markets function, they are repressed, and oftentimes there is a lot of rent-seeking behavior by etc. So to unleash and even capital flights, UNECA has done a lot of work on that in that regard. So money is not really an issue when it comes to the bigger picture of creating decent work. It's really serious commitment and a renewed social contract among the decision makers who are squandering a huge amount of resources in the country. Thank you.
Thank you. Actually, I think you touched on two things that I agree a lot on. The last bit that you made about Africa has a lot of money. Actually, Africa, because most people think Africa is in debt and everything, but the amount of capital flight that happens from that means there's a lot of research done, and one of my papers in my previous life was also on Africa being a creditor nation, a creditor continent. I mean, Africa is creditor to because the amount of money that leaves from here. So money is definitely not a constraint. And interestingly enough, you were talking about something that I've always found. Why has crises always kind of give you a pause to see what you want to do, and how countries and different countries come out of it. And the only region in the world where I thought that crisis really helped Asia. That's the only thing that comes to mind. Asia, right? I mean, like, because their macroeconomic policy, their institutions, they changed everything. I mean, like, going forward, and that's why Asia is where exactly it is, right? So most of the, I mean, like, Latin America has been in crisis forever, and it just doesn't learn its lessons. I mean, like, so yeah. So those are very, very important lessons. Just before I turn to Saurabh, let me ask Kunal, you actually, I think you mentioned briefly also, UN Wider has a book on informality and policy implications, I think, right? The job ladder, which has been widely praised for providing a new framework which expands from a lens of formal informal to include lower tier. And you mentioned one of it. Did you want to actually give a little bit more detail about the results that emerged from that book on this different tiers and upper tier informality? And
mention a little bit.
You did exactly.
Yeah. I think the point that we were trying to make a very important point, which actually I have a question showed up earlier, which kind of that the problem that I think we all face is that we see informality in this homogeneous way, right? So because we think the formal is the place that people have to go to, and then that's the rest of it is informal, and that's a mistake. I mean, in a continent where 80% of the workers are informal, how can you think of informality as a homogeneous category, right? It doesn't make any sense, and that's also true in South Asia also, actually. So I think what we try to do is unpack informality and also understand that informality, so that there are two different ways looking at it. One is that self-employment, wage employment. You might think that's not so obvious, but this is important. If you are a self-employed, you are owning your enterprise. It may be a small little enterprise with hardly just a family members working there. But still, you're owner, and maybe that enterprise can grow, and then you can employ some other people outside the family, and then that becomes an enterprise that actually might move to the formal sector. So that kind of thing is different from a wage employment where you're working for somebody else, right? And these kinds of types of work are very different. And I think we need to unpack informality in that dimension for sure. The other dimension on unpack informality is informality into what we call lower tier, upper tier. Lower tier is basically work that anybody can get. There's no barriers to entry. You want to be a street vendor, okay, you need to get a cart, maybe, but there's not much else to be involved in the lower tier work. So there's no barriers to entry, and pretty much you don't need any education and so on and so forth. This is why all workers are streaming from villages to cities now in Asia and in Africa pretty much end up in there because they don't have enough education to move to the formal sector or upper tier job. Upper tier is where you need this. There are barriers to entry. Like, as I mentioned, mechanic, you have to have some vocational training, right? If you are, suppose you become bigger and you start employing people in your enterprise, you need credit. You can't employ workers outside the family without paying them wages, and therefore that you need credit. So this means that those kind of informal work is different, completely different. It cannot, conceptually different from lower tier work. And often economists and policymakers kind of bundle this together, and then don't understand then that has very different policy implications, right? Because how you think about those, the upper tier may have a different set of policy implications than the lower tier. So are we to unpack this and say, look, let's think about the schema and actually can use it in many countries, and then start thinking, okay, how workers are moving around in these categories, right? And then their policy implications of why some workers don't move, why some workers move. For example, we see clear differential in gender mobility. I mean, in other words, women are less likely to move up than men. That means there are certain barriers women face more than men, right? So these things, I think we need to move away from the way we've been thinking of informality, both in the policy world and in the academic world. So what we try to do in this project we did in UniWider is try to open up this possibility, and then of course others can take this work forward. And actually already had discussions showroom about work in ECA. So so I think that was the intention, just to make us think that informality is not one big homogeneous category.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Because everybody, and 80 to 90% people are in the informal sector, right? So they're not all the same. So thanks for actually giving a little bit more context to it. Okay, so let me turn to our last panelist before we open the floor. So sort of multiple crises. We all know what we've been going through. Accelerated probability of a conflict. From a social perspective, what should policymakers consider to reduce tensions and to ensure social mobility? For instance, migration. I mean, like, this is always a controversial effect of conflicts. Would appreciate your views on how to diffuse tensions around migration. And if you also wanted to talk about migration creates a lot of informal workers and how to deal with that as well. Let me lump it all together.
Thank you, Shweta, and thank you, colleagues. I think it's been a very, very interesting session, and I must confess that I have not read the report, but I take comfort from the fact that I have followed the work that it is based on for the last so many years. The wonderful work that UN Wider has been doing on transformative societies, and the number of documents and the reports that have been produced as a result of that. So I think I can get away by sharing my thoughts without having read the book. So no, but okay, thank you very much for that. Okay, on this, yeah, multiple crises. In fact, crises are now the new normal, and I think this is something that all of us, especially after the pandemic, are coming to realize now. So if it's not COVID that gets you, then it'll be Ukraine, or now if it's not Ukraine, it is the Middle East. So something or the other is always going to be happening. In the meantime, we are, of course, the most invisible crisis is the climate crisis. So some are more visible, some are more vocal, some are more sort of occupy a lot of public attention, and some of them are silently catching up on you. So I think you're right. This focus, this international narrative now is around crisis, which is for the policy and the analysts, for the policymakers and analysts, I think it's a good thing that at least now crisis is something whose day has come, and this is going to be addressed. I'm hoping that it is going to be addressed in a meaningful way. What should policymakers consider to reduce tensions and ensure social stability? Well, depends on how much time I have, because there can be a huge list of things that the policymakers need to do, both in the economic sphere and both in the social sphere, and what can be done to reduce or ensure social stability. But let me narrow it down to about three things that I think can be done. Some of these have been addressed here already, so I will not repeat that, but I'll try and give a sort of a different perspective on some of these. One, of course, is the one on inequality, and I think the inequality has been talked about a lot, and there has been a strong link between inequality and social stability, and it's there. Though, of course, whatever causes or whatever disrupts social stability is a trigger, but it comes on top of an underlying level of inequality or lack of social mobility, I would say. So I think that becomes extremely important, that we need to keep in mind. And Africa, of course, we know has huge levels of income and consumption inequality. In fact, I think 8 of the top 10 countries with highest inequality are in Africa. Most of them, I think, are in Southern Africa, and there are structural reasons for that. But still, the fact remains that inequality is an important issue. This is not to say that nothing can be done, because there are many countries and many examples within Africa where inequality has reduced also. So in that sense, I think inequality is something which is amenable to policy. And I think it's important that we start focusing on that. Now, what can be done? I think we did talk about growth, and I think what becomes more important is the nature of growth. And I'm not sort of beating new ground, but I think this whole issue of the nature of growth and the fact that growth has a very low elasticity of poverty reduction in Africa is something which is very important. And we do talk about the Southeast Asian example and how poverty was reduced in about 10, 15 years, or maybe 20 years in Southeast Asia. But because the poverty elasticity of growth was very high. I mean, it's more than 2%, or maybe more than 2 or 2.5 or 3 or something like that in some countries. In Africa, it is less than 1. The average is about 0.7. and some countries might be having about 1.4. But I think that is an important factor, that the elasticity of growth is, the growth is not leading to any kind of reduction of inequality or poverty reduction. That brings me to the next point, and I think one of the key features in Africa is the depth of poverty. And when we talk about the depth of poverty is huge. It's about at least, I think, about twice the global average, which is about the depth of poverty, the poverty gap, which is called. It's about 8% globally. In Africa, the average is 15%, 15 or 16, and some countries are 30%. So in the sense that the poor are so low below the poverty line that none of the things that you might keep doing, and governments have been sensitive to that and have been doing, has not been helping really. And so the rate of poverty reduction is extremely slow in Africa. And because of the crises, it goes up and down. So there is a vulnerability to poverty. I mean, people who are poor are there, but who are the new, who have crossed the poverty line, they can get into the poverty because of the crises and other things. And so I think that poverty dynamic is something which is very important, and that has to be taken into account. And I think I remember we were working on this in 2021, the economic report in Africa, and there at that time, because of the COVID, there were many people. It was a consideration that there were many new poor. The point is whether the new poor were new to poverty or not, because they would have been already been poor who had crossed the poverty line, and because of the crisis have been got below the poverty line. So I think the dynamic movement around the poverty line is something which is very important. Now, having said that, we shouldn't forget what is group of people who are so far below the poverty line. And so in that sense, I think a single sort of policy approach, or maybe one set of policies for reducing poverty are not going to work. What has been recommended a lot is either social assistance or creating jobs. Now, we have looked at the level of social assistance, and I think the social assistance per capita is so less, much lower than the level that they are below the poverty line. And so that social assistance can keep going, it's not going to help them cross the poverty line because the consumption levels are so low. That's one. And then when you're recommending jobs for these people, they don't have the skills necessarily, and they form the lower tier of your framework, and so they don't have the skills to even have an expectation of crossing the poverty line. So in that sense, it is a fairly depressing situation, but that's how it is. So the social assistance is too little. They don't have the skills to have any kind of productive jobs for them to have a decent job. So that is the prospect of crossing the poverty line is very limited. At the people who are around the line, now that is an issue that we should be targeting, I think. And what is happening is when we are having a poverty reduction sort of approach and policy for reducing poverty, the whole thing gets clubbed together. And very often it becomes an either or situation, which neither helps the people who are right at the bottom, nor does it help the people who are around the poverty line. And so I think unpacking our sort of ideas and notions about what needs to be done, I think it's very important. And a lot of it has to be based on the data. That becomes very important. So that's one thing. I'm not going to talk about jobs and demography that has been mentioned already. So I'm not going to go there, but that is definitely one of the things which is going to reduce and going to help reduce tensions and ensure stability. But let me just quickly go back to your framework, which incidentally is a lot similar. And this is the private seminar that we were having together before we came here, was the framework that we looked at on the informality. And that was that a lot of people don't have the skills. And so they are involuntarily in the informal sector, which is very similar to that. And the person who triggered off the Arab Spring in Tunisia was an informal worker. So definitely, if he had a stable job and was not in debt, he might have not triggered off the arrow spring. So that's something to keep in mind. So that's something which is very important. The other thing this you mentioned, Shweta, about the migration thing. Well, I think diffusing tensions arising from migration is both whether we look at migration within the country internally or externally, and I think uh, either the social instability or tensions drive migration, and migration also drives tensions and social stability. So it's a dual causality, and I think that is something that needs to be kept in mind. On the migration work that we are doing, in fact, is currently at the moment, and we are having an expert group meeting next week. Exactly on the similar theme on linking up jobs and employment with migration strategies. And one of the key messages that are coming out of that work is that I think we need to link our skills migration with national employment strategies, so that at the moment what is we are looking at migration is on one hand in the policy level, and we're talking about jobs for the youth. And I think it's important to link together. There is no magic wand. It's not going to solve all the problems. But I think this interlinking to ensure that the skills which are migrating are more through regular pathways and rather than through irregular means and other ways can be in such a way that the countries can benefit, the host countries, sorry, not the source countries can benefit. I think that becomes very important. So I think in that sense, this could help address some of the social conflict and social stability issues. So let me just stop here, and happy to engage with this discussion. Thank you.
Let me actually, because we have half an hour left for a seminar, so let me give very. Should I just open for? Yeah, let's just open, because I think we've dominated the space a lot. So let's actually open it for questions you may have. So please let me know. You in Lusungu? Okay, go ahead, and please introduce yourself and ask your question.
Hello, my name is Lusungu Kayani. I am a social affairs officer here at ECA with the Urbanization and Development section, and I just want to thank all the panelists and our moderator for such an interesting discussion. I have so many questions, and we only have half an hour, but one question I had for Kunal was around the selection of the SDGs that were focused on the report. I noticed that SDG 11 around sustainable cities and communities wasn't a focus, but when we speak about informality, and thank you for those tiers. I think that's such a brilliant analysis, and I think it's important to think about decent jobs across all these tiers and how to move from one tier to the next and what inequality means within these tiers. So I think there's a lot to explore, like beyond this, and even when you're thinking about informal employment, like in the waste sector, you think about waste pickers. They're not all just one homogenous group. There's the rag pickers, the ones who do the basic sort of collection at the home level, and then they're the ones who are the middlemen who kind of dominate the waste environment. So kind of understanding the inequalities just within one informal form of employment and how to move up the ladder in that way, I think is just like a brilliant area of research and moving forward. But my question was more around urban and why SDG 11 sort of wasn't a dominant theme, and also how you see informality, given the fact that urban wasn't something that wasn't seen. Is this informality in the rural sense and in the urban sense, and with African cities growing, as we heard in the introduction of this talk, cities are growing very quickly here, and I don't know how many are going to be urbanites in the future. So how do we reconcile not prioritizing the city in our analysis? That's the first question. Thank
So let me start off. Actually, you'll be pleased to know that we have started a work which was 2 years back. We started a project on cities. And this is a project we started funded by the FCDO, the UK government. It's called African Cities Research Consortium. So right on cities and on Africa. Okay. And the puzzle, so we are this is a big consortium. There are many others working on different issues on cities, like housing and land and so on. But our focus in this work we're doing in UNE wider is on structural transformation. Why? Because there's one important puzzle which has not really been addressed very well, which is that when countries become urbanized, there is structural transformation. In other words, more proactive activities in cities, right? Think about agglomeration economies, think about China, Shanghai, and so on. So that's been the nature. So urbanization rates go up, and any measure of structural transformation also increases. So let's say manufacturing employment in total employment, right? What's interesting in Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, is that urbanization has proceeded quite rapidly, but that has not led to structural transformation. Okay, this is a really important puzzle, and in fact, there has been quite a bit of work, but no clear answer. I mean, there are economists in International Growth Center who are working on this, and World Bank. There's been no clear answer on why this is the case. So, what we did in this project, and unfortunately, the publication is not yet there, but they're coming soon. What we did is that we did very detailed city studies of 6 cities, and we combined qual and quant because we felt we had to do these interviews with city leaders, municipal authorities, firms, and so on. And these cities are, so that you know where you'll see the papers, are Accra, Nairobi, Harare, Addis Ababa, Dar es Salaam are the cities. So this we kind of West Africa, East Africa, conflict-affected countries. Harare, obviously, one of them, and not. So what we find there, the reason what we don't see such a transformation is a lot of it politics, and this is what Abebe mentioned. Actually, a lot of what is the deals that happen between city leaders, political leaders, local levels, and enterprises. And what is the difference? Perhaps this is speculation because we need to do comparative work with what's happened in Asia. Because in Asia, that urbanization led to structural transformation. So why do we see this big difference in these two continents, right? And one argument is that, so for example, in cities in Africa, it's surprising that a lot of investment is in real estate, which is paradoxical because we think about there's not enough money for investment. Where is the investment? Why real estate? Because that's more profitable than investing in manufacturing. So the returns to real estate, and so if I'm an investor and I need to think about the returns to my investment, I'd rather use it to buying land in cities rather than thinking about starting enterprise. And that a lot of that is the nature of the way that city leaders, political leaders at the local level and at the national level interact with firms, especially which are the more export-oriented firms, right? So there is where the problem is that a lot of this are highly informalized enterprises, house enterprises. And so you see a kind of a missing set of firms which are manufacturing or tradable services, which are relatively large, and so you have economic scale, and we can see agglomeration economies. And so I can't give the complete answer to your, but this is a really interesting question, right? And we are working on that now. So in a few months' time, you'll see lots of publications coming out on this question about subtle transformation and cities in Africa. And that kind of leads to this SDG 11 question, but SDG 11 within the context of SDG 8, that's important, right? Because in a way, you cannot look at cities and not think about agglomeration economies, social transformation. So we're placing SDG 11 in the context of SDG 8, which is what we've already been working on, and trying to see where the fits are. So just to sort of say we have not even forgotten SDG 11, but we started that work much later, and that's why the work from that research center consortium is not yet published. But all the city studies are done. The Addis was the one that we did recently, Addis Ababa one, and all of this studies will be out in as our working papers very soon. So just wait and see. So on the and then on the and sorry, you had a question about a second question, right? Okay, okay, right. Because on the macro, so there is a bias. This is a micro-oriented. So I'm going to be very honest about this report. There's no point hiding that fact, right? But I think I think what has happened in Africa, and you're the best person to tell me if I'm wrong, that macro stability issues that were there very much earlier are less evident. High inflation, volatile inflation, exchange rates going all over the place. Those kind of issues are less evident now. Not completely gone, but are less evident now. Latin America, it still lurks in a few countries. Argentina, of course, the classic example, right? So here, that sort of question has been there has been this move for central bank to take charge of macro policy, fiscal and monetary policy. And I do think the region has benefited from low and less volatile inflation, and for the fact that we have now a fairly stable, we don't have this big balance of payments crisis that we used to see before, structural adjustment programs. Those days seem to be past. And I think because central banks are become quite strong in effective macro policy. You may differ from me on this, but that's my understanding. But there is a bigger question, I think, on macro, which we need to think about, which is that on investment. If you see investment rates in Africa, so gross capital formation rates, they are far lower than Asia. And in fact, the other region where it's very low is Latin America. That's, of course, because we know what the problem there is. It's to do with macro instability, right? So why? So Africa cannot ever if you think about convergence in economic growth, the only way to do it really is to have higher investment and productivity of investment. Obviously, that's also important. So there's a question of why have we not seen that? And is it the case too much public investment, private investment, the debt problem that we're seeing now, which is leading to also uncertainties among investors? Or is there other issues that are more micro-related issues that Abebe mentioned? I do think that those micro-related issues, and I have to say we haven't got any paper on this, so that's something we need to think about, I think are more critical here than the macro-related issues of why we see lower investment in this continent, right? And I think it's an open question that, what is it that's driving this low investment, linked to also low domestic savings too. That we have some project on that too. Low domestic savings, all linked to this question that there isn't enough savings instruments for households to invest in, which pay off a certain rate of return, right? So this is a broader question which we haven't tackled in this report, but we have work going on. We couldn't put everything in this report. We have work going on this, but I think it's a really open question from our side. Why are we seeing lower investment rates in the continent and not catching up? If you see the level of investment rates here, I don't see any convergence. I was looking at it the other day. Don't see any convergence with over time with, say, at least Asia, right? So that's a really important question, maybe that you can give an answer on. And on the informal formal, one thing I want to say, and this is something I strongly believe in, that the way to think of formalization is not through simply more social protection programs or more labor rights to informal workers. The only way to get informal to formal is through productivity growth. That is the bottom line. If you see East Asia, why have you seen so much of formalization in East Asia? there's been wonderful work by the former chief economist of the World Bank, Penny Goldberg, and co-authors, is because the trade globalization really led these firms to integrate. Vietnam is the classic example here, integrate and grow bigger in size, and therefore also formalize. So I think that question, therefore, the bigger question then is, why are we not seeing more productive firms in the continent, right? Informal or formal. And that's something that we should think more about, perhaps for a future research program. Why are we not seeing productive firms in the continent, not just the formal sector, or as productive as we see in Asia, but also in the informal sector, right? So I think that's a question. I think I would say the informal, formal. I see it from a productivity angle rather than thinking about expanding social protections, which will happen once you have more productive firms. They can pay, they can contribute more to social insurance and so on, as we saw in Asia. So that's the way I think about it. And taxation of informal sector, the problem in Africa is that that they are not taxing rich individuals as much, or rich corporations. If you look at the share of direct taxes over total taxes in this continent, is far lower than many others because they don't want to essentially move to direct income taxes, basically, than VAT. And VAT is highly regressive. There's an over reliance on VAT here and under reliance on income taxes. Now, why is that? Of course, there are political economic reasons. Now, there is a lower tax base in those groups. They're not enough, maybe, rich individuals. But again, we heard about this financial flows and capital flight. So I think the tax problem here is, it's in my mind, a lot about the structure of taxation. And the shift has to happen from indirect taxes, and particularly VAT, because trade taxes now fallen to a very low level now, right, towards direct taxes. And that then enables states to raise revenue and not worry about the informal sector as a source of tax revenue, where literally they are this informal sector, as we were discussing earlier, it's just about surviving, really. So that's, the way I see the tax, which again, we may disagree on this, but I think that's something we need to think about. How do we make this transition? Because in the Western countries, the transition was very important, moving to income taxes. It was actually a feature of state building in those countries. And again, in other regions, we see this shift happening over time. Why not here? Is it a political economy issue, or are there other things that are coming in, like lack of knowledge about who are the people who can pay tax and so on? That I can't give an answer, but I think there is an important question to think about here about the tax issue. Yeah, I'll stop here. Maybe there are others who can.
Yeah, okay. I think very quickly, the role of macroeconomic policy, I think, in my view, is super critical. I mean, in everything we discuss about the decent work is framed within a macroeconomic policy that allows a country to be competitive, that allows a country to utilize its resources optimally. Say, for instance, exchange rate policy. If you have an exchange rate policy that is hostile to external and domestic environments, then talking about decent work doesn't make sense. The same thing about fiscal policy. On the efficiency side, for instance, governments can do a lot better if they utilize whatever scarce resources they have efficiently. A very good example, I think, we have done on African governments. The spending they do and then the returns they get out of that spending on education, health, infrastructure is very, very low compared to any other region in the world. And then, yes, when you also broaden the macroeconomic policy, improving economic fundamentals, allowing the markets, for instance, to function better than they should, for instance, the tax system to be fair. We've done a lot of, I've done at least a lot of work on this. I tell you, African citizens, it's based on Afrobarometer data set, when they were asked about tax compliance, the most important factor explaining their attitude is the perception of corruption within the government authorities. Even when we used a very rough instrument, say the ethnicity of the citizen and the ethnicity of the president during that time in that country, we found a very strong correlation. People who think their ethnic leader is the president feel people should pay taxes. And the other people, they say, no, we should not pay taxes. That's a kind of, so there is a lot of mileage, yes, Africa can improve upon when it comes to macroeconomic policy. So I think for me, a very good macroeconomic management is even crucial, more than the sectoral, the micro, because they work in that environment. You work in Ethiopia, so you know what I mean. Yes, I mean, this is, but I also recognize there is a trade-off between macroeconomic stability policies and growth promoting policies when you are in a very tight spot. Say, for instance, I looked at Ethiopia, for instance, in the last 10 years. If you just simply plot real GDP growth on this side and a measure of macroeconomic instability on this side, you find a very clear pattern that when the country was growing, macro stability was okay. And then when the country slowed down, macroeconomic instability. So now the government is trying to attain macroeconomic stability on the one hand, but also promote growth on the other. So if I am to advise them, they have to go to economic fundamentals, including what I have mentioned regarding exchange rate and all of that. Now linking this to informality, which you have raised, one thing I forgot earlier to mention, to improve, for instance, the condition of citizens to transit into a decent work is a structural change. I think it's a concept. If you look at some of the evidence for Africa, a lot of transition that has happened in Africa is from informal subsistence farming to informal urban casual employment with almost similar productivity levels. So the situation has not changed a lot for millions of people. Some jobs created in the manufacturing, finance, etc. They have done quite okay, but generally speaking, if governments want to stimulate decent work in the continent, their hope is they need to change the structure of the economy the way other countries have done it. Now, when it comes to taxation, why do even higher informal people, businesses want to be informal? Is a tax regime, administration, and tax systems. So I think this is a very important one. But the other is accreditation process. I mean, this is a creative way of bringing informal skills into the formal channel. I mean, we can talk about it a lot. And finally, I think just the last word from me is on your presentation, which I liked again a lot. Maybe your team can try also to look at how much it takes to eliminate poverty. No, because you said, the distance from the poverty line is 15%, convert it into billions of dollars, and then simply divide it by the GDP of the continent. And by the way, it's not large. I've done it. It's about, it's a small fraction of the GDP because of high inequalities that we have.
Yes.
Eliminating poverty is not a big task for Africa. Actually, it is a mechanism in which you channel those resources because the super rich are not taxed. No, ask every rich people how much tax they pay. They tell you none. So thanks.
Exactly. I mean, this is exactly the domestic resource mobilization avenue. I just want to come to a couple of points here. I know we are coming close to 4:30, so I'll be brief. This is on the informal formal. I think a lot has been said about it, and you asked a very important question as to what should the policymakers do. I mean, the policymakers should stop trying to formalize the informal. Instead, focus their energies on increasing the productivity. And the reason why productivities are not high is because the skills levels are so low. I mean, we have been looking at numbers, and in fact, we'll be presenting this at the next week's EGM. Is that the skill levels are extremely low in Africa, and as a result, productivity is low. So the same low skills in the rural areas from the low skill farming gets transferred to the low skills in the urban areas. And so in that sense, there is no structural transformation, there is no increase in productivity, and therefore there is no entry into the formal labor market. I mean, so that element, I think our energy, the policymakers should really strategize as to what should they be focusing on. In fact, we would go as far as to even suggest on the lines of climate finance, that is the buzzword of the day, is to have skills finance for Africa. I think that is something that is extremely essential. And if we have to try and hit different objectives at the same time, I think that is something that should be one strategy that should become a central feature of much of our policy making. I think that's important. On the tax issue, I think it has been said, and I agree entirely with what Professor Sen has also said, and Abebe also. My only question is that a lot is made about the tax to GDP ratio in Africa being very low. It's about 17% or something like that. And very commonly it is compared with OECD, where it is 32, 34%. But what is the level, and I don't have the answer, but what is the level of tax to GDP at the GDP per capita level? At that level of national income, I mean, it is 17%, it is low. And for the reasons that have been talked about, and the fact that our priorities are misaligned, we are not focusing on income tax, we are focusing more on the regressive taxation. And then there is corruption, there is no incentive to give tax, to pay taxes. And we are not sort of targeting the right people. All that is there. But I think if you look at the numbers, and this should be an idle sort of evenings exercise to look at the numbers on tax to GDP and compare it with the GDP per capita, and where are we? Are we doing that badly? I don't know, but that's something to be discussed. Thank you.
So much, everyone. Any last minute questions? We have 5 minutes left. Yes, please. Yeah, please,
I
Professor
want
Saleh.
to make two comments. One about the
And after you finish, there was something that you mentioned about squeezing out money, and I had an anecdote to that. That's exactly what happened in Southeast Asia and Korea during the '97 crisis when they reformed so much and they changed things. My anecdote was really about the squeezing and getting tax money out. And the story is from Afghanistan, where I was until about 6 months ago. And there, the Taliban government have been very smart. I mean, they are very strong on corruption, so sort of anti-corruption, no corruption and everything. But what they have done is they have gone through a whole list of things where you could collect taxes and which were not being collected by the previous government because there was so much rampant corruption that people were paying off and having us to for example, to register your business. To register your business, you have to pay some certain amount, and by paying a bribe, you could get the registration papers, and you just with a small amount of money. And there, they have plugged all those loopholes. So on the one hand, they are not corrupt. But on the other, they have been able to raise a lot of resources locally. I mean, this way. So in that sense, that is what they have done. And who's screaming and kicking and squealing? It is the middle class. And because they are the ones who are having to pay. But they should have always been paying it. You see, that's the problem. And so this kind of an inconsistency has been resolved there. Some of the good things and a lot of bad things there.
On that note, shall I bring this session to an end? Unless anybody has a very burning question for any of the panelists. Nope.
I just want to thank all the panelists for
Exactly, yeah.
you.
I'm only. Thank you. Thank you so much. Actually, with I got lots of thoughts for our later discussion. Actually, from the panelists. So thank you all, and thank you for coming. When we were planning, we had no idea that today is going to be a disruptive day in Addis Ababa. So thank you all for being here. Until we see you later.
Just one announcement. We have circulated a survey just to.
We have refreshments outside now. Okay, so let's go and actually.